Even longtime viewers of the 8 Passengers channel had become very, very worried by August 30th, 2023. That was the date when we found out that things were even worse than people suspected, because behind the scenes, there had been rampant abuse going on. And we found this out for sure because one of the children actually escaped and got to authorities, and they removed all 4 of the minor children from the care of Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt, who had been an instrumental part of this abuse. Ruby and Jodi were arrested, and a lot of the story of how this happened, at least from the perspective of the eldest daughter, Shari, is shared in her new book, The House of My Mother. This is my copy. It is an incredible book, and I highly recommend it. There is also going to be more information from the documentary that was recently released called The Devil in the Family. In The House of My Mother, Shari talks about some of her most intimate moments being exposed on camera over the course of the family's experience with family vlogging. And she also talks a lot about how things further devolved once Jodi Hildebrandt entered the picture. But even beyond those two things, she also talks a lot about what it was like to grow up with Ruby as a mom and how there was mental and emotional and even physical abuse long before Jodi or even YouTube entered the picture. But now let's take it back to the beginning, aka when the two parents met at Utah State University. Kevin and Ruby met pretty early on, and only 14 days after meeting, they were engaged. They seemed pretty well matched. Kevin was more laid back, and Ruby was rigidly perfectionist. Shari actually describes that pursuit of perfectionism by saying Ruby's entire self-worth was built on exceptionalism. So if she couldn't be extraordinary, then what was the point? Which I think is a really interesting reflection on how Ruby viewed the world and herself. I would say the most notable thing about all the information we get about that early period when they met at university is the fact that Ruby appears to have been focused on appearances and perception. And she also seemed to almost be focusing on finding someone who would slot into this preformed role of her husband. There seems to be a theme of Ruby expecting everyone in her family to fit themselves around her, fit themselves into the space that she has left for them, rather than regarding them as entire human beings with their own hopes and passions and dreams and hurts. There's a passage about how Ruby was often emotional and would have these fits of tears, but didn't seem to care when her children were upset. And Shari states in this passage, perhaps that's why she wanted so many children. A set of Russian nesting dolls, each one a slightly smaller version of the last, to absorb the tsunami of her raging emotions. For what better way to fill the gaping void within than to surround yourself with adoring little mini-me's? It's honestly a pretty haunting image, because what happens when those adoring little mini-me's step out of line? What happens when you're reminded that they're tiny humans who are finding their identities and they're not just extras in the story of Ruby's life? There's an early example in the book where Shari is forced to play piano simply because Ruby has decided that all of her children will play piano. Now, a lot of parents make their kids learn a musical instrument. What's really concerning is how if she failed to meet her mother's expectations with regard to her piano lessons, there would often be physical punishment. And I think it created a situation where Shari, the way she describes it, you get the impression that she got to a place where she was constantly waiting for that physical reaction from her mother. Shari talks about how at only 5 years old, she was learning through these piano lessons that her mother's love was something that had to be earned. It wasn't something she could just take as a given. And that, I think, is the thing that is critical here, is the issue isn't that she wanted her to learn piano. It's that performing the way she wanted her to meant whether or not she received love. There was this environment of just fear all the time being created. Now, I actually didn't realize this, but Shari reveals in the book how Ruby started not with a YouTube channel, but actually first had a blog. It was like a short-lived blog that was documenting recipes and their family life, followed by a few other blogs. It doesn't sound like any of them really took off significantly. But what I thought was interesting was Shari shared how documenting the family life in either blog form or as a vlogger on YouTube, both of them kind of fit in with values that are taught in the Mormon church. She describes how it encourages keeping detailed records for future generations and how this felt like a different format of that, which I think is very interesting. Ruby's siblings start channels before she does, and Shari even talks about wondering if her mom would want to do the same. But she actually thought that Ruby would never do it because she thought Ruby would never want people to see how angry she is all the time. Probably not realizing that Ruby would be able to edit out all of those ugly moments of anger and lashing out at her children. As we know, Ruby does eventually start her own. So let's go to January 8th, 2015. This is the day that the first video on the newly created 8 Passengers YouTube channel is posted, and it shows the gender reveal of the 6th and final Franke child. This video marks the beginning of the children's lives as family vloggers, and it really drastically shifted life in the Franke household. Channels like this have become really controversial, and I will freely say that I am very much on the side that is very, very against family vlogging. And in fact, if anyone does think that family vlogging is harmless, I would argue that Shari's account proves otherwise. It proves how inherently damaging it is. For one thing, she describes how they felt constantly watched. Everything had to be filmed. There was no family event that could go without being filmed. Shari actually compares it to feeling like being in a circus sideshow. And she talks about how when they started earning money, it only got worse. She talks about how they made these changes that made it feel more like they were living in a filming set than an actual home. They changed all the lights to be a like bright white that looked better on camera. They couldn't have pictures on the walls. They even changed the color of the walls and the furniture. They switched all of it up just so that it would look better on camera and be more photogenic. So in many ways, everything seemed to revolve around it. And even beyond the home, things like going out and getting ice cream would be turned into leverage for Ruby. She would say, I'll pay for you to go get ice cream, but you have to film the trip. This brings me to the issue of consent. And Shari talks a lot about how there can't be consent for any family vlogger because essentially the way the parent is getting the kid to do it is through things like bribing them by saying, I'll pay for your ice cream, or they will say, I'll take away your new present if you don't do this. Shari sums this up well by saying that none of them ever really had a choice. Even if they would have said they did at the time, there was never really a choice. Shari actually spoke to the Utah legislature in October of 2024, saying there is no such thing as a moral or ethical family vlogger. I also want to include a part of her statement on that day. She said, it is more than just filming your family life and putting it online. It is a full-time job with employees, business credit cards, managers, and marketing strategies. She also says that while she would have told you she had a choice at the time, and many child influencers would say the same, that choice is achieved by parents bribing and shaming them into sharing private moments, even if they don't want to. She also made sure to be very clear that her childhood was ruined by family vlogging long before the abuse of Jodi and Ruby. There's another moment that I think really highlights the relationship with Ruby and Shari. So Shari goes on to start her own YouTube channel. I think because she was already having to share so much of her life via the 8 Passengers channel. And I think she saw it probably as a way to make some money. And I think that's very valid. Even if she's, against family vlogging, at the time, she's probably seeing it as, okay, I can at least make some income, earn money for college, etc. Which, quite frankly, I think her parents should have been putting that money aside because they were earning so much from that 8 Passengers YouTube channel. But we'll move right past that because there's more to unpack here. So she goes on to start her own YouTube channel, but her mom basically not only refuses to give her a shout out or let her put 8 Passengers in her bio, on account of basically saying, oh, you have to make it on your own. It's also the way she does it is almost like she's laughing at her for thinking something so ridiculous. She says, well, Shari, you know that I don't shout anyone out who has less than 100K subscribers. That's like the least you could do for her as a trade-off for putting so much of her life online, but whatever. Moving right along. So Ruby, when she is, I think she's just below 100K when Ruby finally shouts her out. But she then goes on to tell Shari, by the way, you owe me 10% of anything you earn for management fees, even though I don't think she's managing anything for her. And when Shari is understandably like, huh? Ruby tells her, like, she asks if Shari really thinks she could have started a channel, let alone a successful one, without her help. This is like, there's so much I hate about that sentence because, first of all, they're the reason that your channel is successful. Second of all, she didn't have your help because you didn't give her a shout out. That was the whole point of not giving a shout out, wasn't it? But also, like, it is just so like ridiculing. That is such a like, it's like that whole like, do you really think, as opposed to just like stating your reason, you know, like it's like, it's not even just like, I hate what she's saying there, but I also hate how she's saying it. But moving right along, let's talk about Chad. He is the second oldest of the Franke kids. Ruby and Kevin chose to send Chad to one of those like wilderness camps, basically part of the troubled teen industry, which if you just Google troubled teen industry, there is a lot of content explaining how deeply, deeply traumatic and problematic all of those institutions are. So what actually happened? Let's talk about it. There was an incident where he was being disruptive during filming. They were doing a major collab at Universal Studios Hollywood, and he was basically just being disruptive, like making faces in the back and interrupting shots, stuff like that. They sent him back to the room, and he snuck out, though, and went back to the park. And I believe what happened was they came back and he hadn't yet come back. So they didn't know where he was. I do get how that would be very scary for them. However, he was only sent back in the first place because he wasn't falling in line with filming. As he described it, he just hated filming because he didn't like being told what to do or feeling controlled. And I think all of it just goes back to the conversation about how unethical family vlogging is. All this punishment was rooted in him not playing along for the camera, not going according to script. And the fact is, he shouldn't bear that responsibility. I think the most important thing about it is that it led them to seeking out mental health professionals. And because they wouldn't conclusively pathologize him with one of these diagnoses that Ruby apparently wanted, it would lead them to Jodi Hildebrandt. And this would be the beginning of a nightmare for the family.